So I wrote this title in a fit of passion when I was asked to come along and talk about almost a lived experience of doing social media for museums. And I'm conscious that it might be a title that writes a check I can't quite cash, because whenever you're talking about museums, I'm conscious that every museum is different, of different sizes, of different resources. But what this title allows me to do is to talk about how we could conquer social media almost as if none of that exists. So almost in an ideal world, but actually I think some very realistic behaviors and changes that we could be doing to do a better job on social media. I do have a disclaimer though, that this will be quite British and Eurocentric, and that is because I am British. I only speak one language because of our education system, and kind of as a direct result of that, a lot of my references will be quite British, kind of American centric. So I apologize for that, because I know this is quite an international group, but it's quite classically British. Now, naming your talk How Museums Could Conquer Social Media sort of implies that museums are not conquering social media. And you would be right. That is what I'm saying. Because I've been working in museums and digital for over 10 years now. And when I think back, the sector has moved on a lot in a lot of ways, but in a lot of ways, it has also kind of stayed the same for those past 10 years. A lot of the same frustrations are the same. There have been some breakout successes, a lot of okay successes, but it also begs the question, what does conquering social media actually look like? And my benchmark has always been someone I know mentioning something a museum has done on social media who doesn't work in museums. So if it's someone like my family, or if I see someone random I know on social media resharing something that a museum has done, that is usually my benchmark for success. But I don't see it particularly often. But there's also a reason why we aren't conquering social media at the moment. And that's basically capitalism. So I know my bio says I've worked in a couple of corporate places, and it's just a fact that we can't invest in the same way that other organizations do. We're usually surviving on a kind of meager diet of government subsidies, donations, and what scraps we can put together from a shop, cafe, and potentially flogging a few images. So I'm under no illusions that the answer to my question could very easily just be money. If we had money, we could solve the issue. We could hire staff, we could do the strategy, we could make the assets, and we could do very well. But some of the blame is also down to simply what museums are. I should also say I'm quite a pessimistic person, and people are doing things very well, but I just love the pessimism. So museums were made for an essentially 19th and 20th century world where physicality was paramount. We deal with physical objects in physical buildings, where we need physical people to physically visit to give us physical value and ideally physical money. We are not particularly built well for a digital age. Our staffing structures, our priorities, and our missions are overwhelmingly focused on the physical experience. And it's held us back in terms of social media. If you founded a museum today, I think you would invest as much in your digital presence as your physical, or at least in your digital marketing. It's not necessarily a bad thing though. We all know the power of seeing physical objects and heritage sites. It's often why we got into the sector and why we do what we do, but the internet is not a physical space. And there's an interesting thought experiment in thinking how you would achieve your mission if you were untethered from the physical. And I'm not advocating that we shouldn't be trying to get people to our physical spaces or come to our events or enjoy that experience of engaging with history and heritage and cultural heritage. But by starting with that very physical objective, we are working against ourselves when it comes to social media. And it is doable. I know we all have emails, we all have to attend meetings. That is pretty much 70% of what my job is. But there are people out there producing content with a phone and whatever knowledge they have in their brain. It is possible. It's a question of priorities and sometimes imagination. And time and investment, yes. But like I said at the beginning, this is a talk about how museums could conquer social media if you almost got rid of all of the bureaucracy that's standing in the way of it. because I'm conscious that this is a very patronizing slide. I hope you forgive me for it. And it frustrates me because there are people out there who are serving a need which museums could be getting a piece of. It's not like people don't like historic content, even when it is quite basic as this. So ever since I had a baby, which is about 6 months ago, I've been listening to the Rest is History podcast. It's a very British reference. There's online communities like Reddit, 18 million subscribers for our history. I'm including this Twitter account, Culture Critic, even though that has very quite fascist undertones. But the amount of people who follow these accounts who just tweet out pictures they've nicked from digitized collections is very large. Weird Medieval Guys, who I'm sure some of you follow, literally just shares strange medieval guys from digitized manuscripts from different institutions across the world. But because the person who runs it is an archivist, they also cite their sources. But they already have 600,000 followers using material that we already have, but just have not used in the same way. And when you look at those kind of accounts who are satisfying that need for historic content on social media, there are a few things they have in common. They're almost always very community-centered. So they're not just broadcasting, they're interacting and reflecting. They're interacting with people and reflecting what people are interested in. It's not just a one-way communication street. It's very much a conversation. They are very often entertaining. So they tell stories and they're either trying to make you laugh or they're just trying to get across information in an accessible way. And if they can't be entertaining, then they're at least interesting, which I always find a bit of a strange distinction. I think you can be entertainingly interesting or interestingly entertaining. So you may not go there for laughs, but you can go there to satisfy your curiosity and find out something new. They're also online first, so their focus is relentlessly online. They're not often trying to get you to do something else. Their focus is on the platform you're already on. And this is the critical one. They add value. So it's not take, asking for things from you, trying to get you to do other things. People have a need, whether it's historical information, whether they're just trying to waste a bit of time on the internet. And museums often add value when you visit them, but they're not necessarily always adding value online to when you're just scrolling on your phone. And when we have all of these people doing these things, we then have museums on social media sending out posts like this, sometimes this. And this is a particularly bad example I saw recently. I really hope the person who posted this hasn't attended this talk, but I have blocked everything out because I'm not like entirely cruel. But I see this all of the time. No one is on social media to find out that a library has an online application form for a reader's ticket. Nobody is using social media for this purpose. It's a classic example of an institution with its own objectives and things it's used to marketing in other ways and slapping it on social media and hoping for the best. And I'm conscious it's very easy to pick holes in things, but it's much harder to think how we can do better. But a lot of it comes down to this. At the moment, for social media at least, it's very often like this Venn diagram. We start with what we want and we kind of shove that down people's throats. And we try around the edges to give people what they want. And this is very often driven by marketing objectives. We need to get people in. We need to make money. We need to make people interested. But it ends up being the majority of what we talk about. Ideally, it should be more like this. But actually, I would argue that on social media, it should be much more like this. So actually, we are always working at a disadvantage on social media because it's very hard to get attention. It's very hard to convince people to follow you, to enjoy your posts. And actually, what we need to do is pivot to giving the majority of content over to what people are interested in, rather than purely what we want them to do. And I do love this image from, I've included a URL in the presentation, which will be sent around afterwards. It's very much like this. And I think we do a very good job of thinking about community needs when it comes to the museum, when it comes to education, a lot of our activities. But when it comes to social media, most of that seems to go in the bin, and we're only thinking about what we're trying to get out of people. And what people want isn't a secret. Even if you're just a casual user of social media, you can see what is interesting to people. And this overall social media data, which I think is trustworthy, even if it's not entirely trustworthy, it's got the right vibe that I want to prove my point, which is not very scientific. I'm conscious that a lot of the previous presentations in this series have been very academic, and I'm going to stop talking about that. But I think most people are online just to stay in touch with what friends are doing. It's why I use social media, and to stay up to date with news and current events. But then it's also just filling up spare time. It's when you're watching TV and scrolling on your phone. It's trying to find something funny or entertaining. It's trying to network. It is almost never to see a post about the new cakes in the museum cafe. But we also have data for why people follow museums and cultural organisations generally. So this is from the Audience Agency, who, disclaimer, I used to work for, but I did work with our head of data on how we collected this information. So they do I think it's a panel survey of a representative sample of the population of the UK, and asked them a ton of questions about a load of different things to do with their engagement with arts and culture. And we asked people who already followed museums and cultural organisations on social media why they did so. And it's very similar to the previous set of data. It's almost the top topic is general interest in the topic. So not even necessarily general interest in the museum itself, but what the museum collects and what it's about. Second, interestingly for me, is entertainment, which I wouldn't have expected for people who already follow cultural accounts, but it shows that they want that, and it's a reason for following. This bit has been cut off, but actually third is for information about events, activities to do on site. And that is very critical to keep in mind. That it's not purely, I'm not saying purely go for the entertainment and general interest and give everyone what they want. People do follow cultural organisations to find out what to do and things to do as well. I'm just saying that the mix is potentially too much on that third point than the others. I also had some extra little bullet points here. So those who had a general interest in the topic as their main reason were less likely to have children under 10. Those who chose entertainment tended to be younger. So I think 30% of 16 to 24-year-olds chose this as their primary reason. And those who chose information about events were more likely to be 25 and over. So you can kind of see that segmentation. If you're looking for activities, potentially to do with your family or kids, you're probably looking for that events and activities. If you're a bit younger, a bit more used to social media, you could say, then you're looking for that entertainment. So what is holding us back from giving people what they want? A large part of it, I would say, is bound up in culture and literacy in an organisation. And social media and digital work has very often been tacked on to organisations. It's been an additional ask on people's jobs, which has meant that it's become quite accidental. And I've been Googling, trying to remember who first came up with this phrase or this idea. I couldn't quite find it. So if anyone knows, please let me know. But this idea of being an intentional publisher rather than being an accidental publisher. So accidental publishing is essentially not having a plan. You're posting because maybe there's an event or there's a thing to sell, but intentional publishing is having that plan, making sure the user journey makes sense and that content is cultivated, particularly on websites. So you're not just posting random things out all the time, but you've thought about what you're trying to get people to do, where you want them to go, and how you're using your different channels to do that. Senior leadership also need to understand the place of social media. I've worked with an unnamed large organisation where the head of that organisation essentially just left the digital stuff to other people and needed people to come around to fix their laptop. And that cannot be the case in 2024. Social media can be much more powerful when it can use the strengths of the organisation to its own advantages, rather than being weakened by being taken advantage of by the rest of the organisation. So anyone who's ever been asked to post a crappy graphic, a message that a trustee has demanded, or a last-minute post about an event will know what I mean. We know social media is good at some things and bad at others, but you very often need leadership to say we post about this kind of thing and not this kind of thing, because we know what works and what doesn't. But equally, those leaders do need a return on investment, which is horrible in some ways, but actually quite essential. And I mean, in the UK, at least 10 years and counting of austerity, you can't just keep throwing money into a hole. I think social media just needs to prove what it's achieving for an organization. We obviously have charitable and educational objectives, but we do somehow need to find a way to make it pay its way. But half-heartedly promoting events and posting images from the collection, just saying what is in the image, isn't going to cut it. You need to have that user journey, getting people to useful places. You need to understand social media's purpose in driving awareness of the organization and getting people to follow you to then do those useful things. You need to perhaps be looking into the creator economy. I've got an example of that later. Or even just using paid ads for the things that actually make money. Ultimately, though, we need to play by the internet's rules. That is probably the core of what I think could make museums could conquer social media. The rest of it supports, but it doesn't matter if you're not actually playing to the strengths of the internet. And museums are used to people playing by our rules. We say don't touch, we say read the labels, we say don't bring your dog. The internet is a forum where people literally vote for whether your post is good or not. They don't care about how important your museum is in the community or how big it is. If it's a big London institution, they care about whether your post is better than the last post they saw, whether it catches their attention, whether it makes them click or do anything. And you could have the best will in the world, but if you can't get people to do that, then you're going to not do well. So I see the rules of the internet as these. And this is a particularly important one for museums because we almost always have our own niche. And some people see that as holding them back. But my experience at the Museum of English Rural Life, which is a very niche, is that you can turn it into a strength because you can almost make anyone interested in anything as long as you pitch it well. Everyone doesn't have to be doing the same thing on social media. We all have different strengths and different audiences. You still need an audience strategy, and you need to make the most of your strengths. The classic example I have for this is a tank museum. It's a niche topic, but it can be incredibly interesting to a niche audience. But it's unlikely that everyone within a physical radius of the museum is super into tanks, I don't think. But there is a global audience who is. So the Tank Museum made a Patreon, makes exclusive content on YouTube for that audience, and makes money doing it. The Crab Museum, which is a small museum in a coastal village in England, and they don't give you textbook descriptions of crabs on their Instagram. They don't do what any other aquarium in the world could do. Their niche is using meme culture to educate people and entertain us with crabs, and also take the piss out of the Science Museum, which takes fossil fuel money. The question I always ask myself when I wrote any content in my jobs has been, who cares? So if you follow me on Twitter, you might know I'm a big hater of the "we're excited to announce" type posts. And if you've ever scrolled through Instagram Reels, through TikTok, even through X/Twitter, as it is on its dying legs, you can see how interesting posts can be. And your message may be super important to you, but it's going to be boring in comparison to everything else on the internet if you don't take a second to think, who cares? Because you may have a hardcore part of your audience who are interested in what you do, but if you don't then try and make it relevant to people outside of that by taking a new angle on it, or telling more stories, or paying more attention to your audience, then you're not reaching beyond that core audience. And this is where you need to focus on content that actually pulls those new people in. I love this TikTok account on the left, which is called The History Gossip, which is talking about, well, it talks about history, but it takes almost like a gossip page approach to it, talking in a very human way for a young audience who probably wouldn't otherwise be interested in why Elizabeth I presented herself as the austere warrior queen that she did. And historic royal palaces in the UK, rather than just saying, here's a chamber pot in X whatever room in Hampton Court Palace, they start with Tudor piss pot. Guess what we discovered in it? And I love this story from the Royal Irish Academy Library. Again, very human tone storytelling approach. It is already 25 past. So turn up. I've mentioned a few times that we're very often broadcasting. That's not how you build a community. And I'm very conscious that everyone will say we have no time. But as I've said, this talk isn't about how you can conquer social media with the time and resources you have. It's how we could conquer it and how we should conquer it without thinking about those things, which I know is not very helpful. Because without building a community, you have nothing. There's a theory out there, which I also haven't cited, which is that you only actually need thousands of fans. And I've found this on accounts with large followings as well. There'll be those fans who always come and engage with you, but they don't do it off their own back. It takes time. It requires replying to people. It requires listening to them and making content that fits their needs. So you've got that committed audience who will keep coming back. But it's also about taking risks. So it's nothing ventured, nothing gained. We're all terrified of culture wars, of getting slated in the press, of dismissal, of doing something that fails. But that is sometimes the game with social media. I'll be talking about ways you can stop that happening. People crave authenticity and they crave relevance and they crave something new. And that means doing some weird stuff and seeing what sticks. It doesn't mean you have to be doing weird, funny stuff all the time, but where there's an opportunity, you should take it. The best social media I've done has been spur of the moment, but it's required a bedrock beneath it to enable it to happen, which is what this section is about. How do we make this happen? Which is my last bit. You'll be glad to know. So you need to be editorial. And being editorial is essentially just knowing what you're talking about and why, and putting that work in place before you do your content. And that doesn't mean what do we talk about as a museum in general, and how do we just do that online? It also means researching that topic and what people are talking about within that topic, what kind of questions they're asking, what people are searching for on Google, and how you can use the strengths of your organization to answer those questions. And content pillars, which is essentially just a fancy way of saying the themes and topics that you talk about, they stop you from posting about anything and everything, and they allow you to actually make some sort of annual plan. And the key thing is using your staff and your stuff, which is your objects, but could be your events program, could be anything, to add value to the topic for people. So you're not just saying, we'll talk about cats, so here's pictures of cats. You're finding out what unique stories you can tell with the expertise in your staff or the stories in your collections. That is more than just, oh, we're just shoving stuff up because it's on the theme. But what I found is this requires your museum actually understanding what it's trying to say in general, who to, and why. And you can't actually take that for granted in a lot of places. Very often, I've been in an institution where I've been asked, what's the point of social media and what are we trying to say and what are we trying to achieve? And then I go back and say, what is the museum trying to achieve? What is the museum trying to say? Who is the museum trying to attract? And that's very often set off an existential crisis where the museum suddenly realizes that we don't know who we're trying to reach and what we're trying to get them to do and what success means. So going back to that senior leadership bit, that is one of the best ways of being quite clear about what you do and do not talk about. You also need to invest in the foundations. So you're going to need a lot of images, and I can say that almost every other organization in the world would kill for the mountain of content that most museums sit on in terms of digitized images, videos in the collection, and pictures you can take around your institution. But you're going to need them, and you're ideally going to need them in an accessible way. I've had to organize out-of-bounds collections and inbound collections where social media teams were allowed to use some images without checking with curators for ethical or legal reasons because that was already sorted, and some bits of the collection which you couldn't. You're going to need basic equipment, ideally a phone. I've only worked in about 2 places where I've had a work phone, so I know that's not always going to happen, but it's ideal. You're going to need staff time. Going back to me saying digital has very often been additional. You need to fight for that time because we do live in a digital reality. We need to adapt to the new age, and that means very often either forcing people to make time or hiring the staff. And going back to my previous slide, you're going to need some sort of strategy, at least to say what channels you're focusing on, who you're trying to reach, and what you talk about. And all of that very often needs digital literacy. So what is the place of these channels and content in what you're trying to do as an organization, and understanding what social media is good for and not good for. But more on the front line, you need to be very online. So being very online is key to actually creating content that the internet likes, because you need to understand what's trending, how people are talking, and experimenting with how you can adapt your museum, its strengths, to social media. And the best places I've worked have had a very writing room environment. So it's not just someone sat by themselves coming up with ideas, but it's a very open environment where you can throw out ideas, test and learn, and people aren't being judged for terrible ideas. It's very much a no ideas are bad ideas. It's also carving out time for reactivity. So going back to those content pillars, that covers everything you tend to talk about and it keeps you relevant. But you should also be planning for what you plan in advance across the year, what you're planning for campaigns. But you also need the reactivity. Most successful social media is reacting to a current event and inserting yourself into it in a way that's authentic, which requires understanding what the internet is talking about and requires testing and learning. So it's a difficult thing to do, but it's essential. Now, I think I said that one was the most important. Maybe this one is the most important. It's having the right people. So I see 3 people, or at least 3 areas of skills, as critical in making museums good at social media. So one is the creative, and this is the person who might be able to use Photoshop, that might be able to shoot a video, they might have the ideas and understand what ideas work on social media, and they very often want to just do lots of different crazy things. You've then got the marketer, the one who understands the back end of the channels, the data, the audience strategy, how you tie things back to objectives and the events you're doing, and the most important things to be posting on from an organizational perspective. And then you've got the expert, the people who actually know the collection or know your audiences, and they're the ones who can be the face of your organization, who can tell you the stories and are essential for having their buy-in. And this is the sweet spot for museum social media. And sometimes you're lucky enough to get all 3 of these things in one. Very often you're trying to get these people in the same room to balance each other out. Because if you left it all to the creative, they'd cause a communications crisis within a week. They'd probably post something unethical about the collections or accidentally wade into a flame war on social media. If you left it to the marketer, I'm not saying all marketers are like this, but it would just end up with promotional posts about everything. And if you left it to the expert, then the content will probably be paragraphs and paragraphs long, and not actually relevant to what the museum's trying to do, but their own pet project. This is very stereotypical, but you kind of understand what I mean. But when you bring them together, they balance out and you get the content that is both creative, so people actually like it, click on it, engage with it. The marketer makes sure that it's targeted at the right people, that the user journey is there, that it's being useful, and the expert is the one actually providing the content and making it relevant to the organization, but also making sure that you're not accidentally being unethical or doing something weird. And very often you'll have bits of these in other people. I'm gonna go past that. So that is a bit of a damp squib ending for how museums could conquer social media, because there is no easy answer. But the core of it, I think, is we sit on so much content. We sit on so many fascinating stories that when I visit a museum, when I hear tour guides talk about it, when I talk to people who work in museums, the stories are there, the enthusiasm is there, but we don't have that time or that space to be telling those stories in an effective way. And a lot of that comes down to that bedrock foundation of giving us that time, making that space, but also taking those risks. So it's a confluence of lots of different things. But social media loves a good story and they love authenticity. And museums have it in spades if we could just take it more seriously. And I think that's the end of what I was going to say.